Welcome to week 6, everyone. Believe it or not, we are through with of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. And I hope that you found reading those books as narratives to be illuminating and to perhaps address some of the concerns that you brought to the class, and of course to raise some challenges that we'll carry with us going forward. It's not incidental where the narratives come in the New Testament part of the biblical canon. There's a reason, I think, historically, why the narratives were placed at the beginning, and only now do we begin to read the letters, starting with Paul's. Obviously, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts were not necessarily written before Paul's letters. In fact, it seems pretty clear that none of them were. And in fact, Paul's letters were written first. But the story of Jesus, and then the way that the Spirit extends that story in the body through a community of broken people in the book of Acts, starting in Jerusalem and then spreading out to Judea and Samaria and towards the ends of the earth. That story is foundational for what the whole New Testament is about. And that, I think, is part of why the narratives are first. This is important as we come into Paul's letters, because often in the way that Paul's letters have been interpreted, the drama of Jesus's life, what led to his death, is sort of disappeared, is not really significant for making sense of what Paul or other later books of the New Testament teach. And we end up with a very kind of thin understanding of Jesus where all he really had to do was die, when in fact it's the life that he lived, the way that he lived, that made his death what it was and gave it the power that it had, according to Paul and others. So I hope that a kind of more patient understanding of who Jesus was and is according to the Gospels and Acts will help us read Paul's letters more carefully, more soundly, to draw interpretations from them that perhaps engage some of the painful legacy that Paul's letters in particular have left, and even to find in them now insight and guidance that will be life-giving for us, whether it's in our practice as therapists, pastors, or in any number of other vocations, just in the life that we're going to live. Now, along these same lines of taking into account the narrative foundation that Paul is building on, as we begin to study his letters, I hope to impress upon you something that I think has been rather systematically neglected in the history of their interpretation, especially in their modern interpretation in the West. And that is that each of Paul's letters is a rhetorical work to his most immediate readers. Because of how his letters have been used often, that particular rhetorical dynamic and the specific situations that it's addressing have been lost. And we find ourselves reading Paul as if he were simply offering so many general theological treatises, or giving us a bunch of general ideas about God, about Jesus, about what it means to be man, what it means to be woman, about marriage, about all kinds of other things. And treating Paul as just giving us a bunch of general ideas like that is, what shall I say? It's been oppressive. It's been violent. It's been psychologically catastrophic. And we really don't want to keep reading Paul's letters that way. We want instead to, first of all, allow Paul to be addressing something specific, and then to be cautious about how we're going to draw general insights or general imperatives from the specifics that he is addressing and how he's addressing them. But then also, we're going to want to ask, as we're studying Paul's letters again and again, what is it that Paul is driving at? What is his purpose at this particular stage of this argument, of this letter? Sort of following the letter as a thread and allowing our interpretation of it to be governed by our sense of the most direct purpose that Paul has in saying what he's saying at a particular point. If we allow that to drift and at some point just think Paul had some general things to say about what it means to be human, then I think we'll come to all kinds of really bad conclusions about what Paul is saying, and we'll use Paul's letters really to great harm. And frankly, for many of us, I think we'll just forget him or try to get as far away from him as possible. So I'm hoping that these two matters, the specific situation that he's addressing, and then the rhetorical dynamics, the specific rhetorical purposes that he has, are going to enrich our interpretation or understanding of Paul, maybe allow his voice to change and how we hear it in our own minds, and open up some new possibilities for what we can learn from Paul and how we can use his letters as scripture. You are going to have all kinds of questions, rightly so, about ways that I interpret Paul. Right off the bat, this first week where we're going to be studying Philemon, Philippians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, all shorter letters of Paul's. And as you might guess from the first half of our class, my understanding of these letters, not able just to digest my interpretation of these letters as a voice that is not final, but does provoke you a little bit, stimulate your thought, direct you back to the text to read it again, to read it afresh, perhaps with some new questions in mind. But I hope we'll also find some safe space to discuss the questions that arise for you in the discussion forums, the video discussion groups, and the like. I have to say, reading the comments that you all have been making on one another's working papers this past week, I was really inspired. Inspired, I think, because you showed what value there is in sharing the task of biblical interpretation in coming up speaking. I want that same spirit, hopefully, to continue in the weeks ahead as listening to different voices, and especially, frankly, voices that have been repressed, that have been silenced, suffocated by the way Paul has been interpreted in a lot of our churches. Listening to those voices is so critical, I think, in this task of a shared approach to interpreting the Bible as a whole, but especially Paul's letters. So looking forward to getting into the final product of your interpretive working papers starting this week. And you will find that I have enlisted some help from a couple of star students from the past in the grading of the last few reviews, as well as these interpretive working papers. I want you to get feedback on both of these assignments before you write another review or write another working paper. And I've asked Allie and Emily, these two star students, as I say, to make some video introductions of themselves. So those should be coming soon. But they've both worked with me in the past. Emily, in fact, was a student in this class last year. And I'm really glad to have them both, because I think it's important as we're considering your work that sort of what it's like to be a student doing that work is part of the process of evaluating that work. So I think that they're contribution will be helpful in the weeks ahead. Looking forward to getting into the second half of the course with you, to the study of letters, and trying to work through the questions that this will no doubt raise for you, that I hope will be stimulating in your own learning process, but maybe even inspiring to you as a Christian, to you as a therapist in training, and to all of you for the just broad vocation of Christian service for which you're preparing. So thanks again for your hard work this past week. Looking forward to week 6.